Welcome to the Composting virtual class event where we're going to talk all things compost and organic matter. So first, let's talk about soil. So soil is made up of multiple things. In a steady state, you have about 25% air, about 25% water. If it gets waterlogged, this goes much higher. And then you have the mineral particles that make up 45%. That's things like your calciums and your potassiums. The magic happens in this 5% fraction. That is the organic matter. And it's not necessarily 5%. It depends where you live. It depends how much work you've been putting in. It depends on what was there when you got there. 5% is the target that we would like to see, but that can be tricky to get to. It takes a long time to build up soil organic matter, and quite honestly, you can lose it pretty quickly depending on tillage, depending on what kind of soil you have in terms of sandy versus clay. So we like to build it up over time, continuously working on it. Plus, we like to use strategies where we try to minimize our loss of organic matter. So things that I like to add would be compost, manure. When I used to work in the country and I could get it easily, I use leaves. I use all my leaves. I have a big sugar maple in my front yard, and those leaves make up a good chunk of my compost pile. That's the carbons I start it with. Leaves are an amazing source of organic matter. Think of what leaves are. A tree sends its roots deep into the subsoil, grabs those nutrients, brings them up, and creates organic matter and sprinkles them all over your yard each year. Don't waste that organic matter. There's a reason that cities will go around with a vacuum truck and suck those up off the tree lawn. That is found money on the ground. I use mine to start my compost pile every fall, and I recommend you do the same. Leaves have more nutrients per pound than manure, believe it or not. And then a great way to maintain and add organic matter into your soil is always keep something planted on it. And so cover crops can be used at any point during the season. So really, what is compost? Compost is the end product of the decay of organic matter. It's not necessarily a fertilizer, although I will tell you I have soil tested tons of composts and it is heavy with nutrients. Any composter will tell you some of the best vegetables they ever grow are the ones that come volunteering out of their compost pile. I like to say it is the soil amendment of choice. Whether you have clay or sandy soil, it doesn't matter, because organic matter is that intermediate sized particle that spaces out the extremely small clay particles and the comparatively giant sandy particles. It improves soil both physically, biologically, and chemically. We talk about compost in terms of adding our browns, which is our carbons, and adding our greens, which is our nitrogen. Our ideal ratio of the two would be a finished compost ratio of 24:1. You'll see that depending on what you add, you're going to have more or less carbon or more or less nitrogen. When you see how wood chips have a 400:1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, it needs lots of nitrogen to break down into compost, and it's going to take quite some time. Certain things that go into compost are fairly close, like a lot of kitchen waste, to finished compost, and that's what I use for my nitrogens. So I start with a base of leaves each fall, and then I dig in and add and incorporate my kitchen scraps, things like eggshells, things like potato peels or apple cores or coffee grounds. It is recommended that you do not add things like bones or fats or dairy or things like that into your compost. If you're going to add weeds, as it says down here, make sure that you don't have seed heads on those weeds, especially if you're going to be doing a cold compost process, because they might not die in that process. And if you're going to add any residue from your garden, make sure that you don't add any residue that might have disease on it, because if you're like me, I spread my compost all over my vegetables and I use it in my container garden. I don't want to be adding disease into those plantings when I spread my compost. So there's two different methods of composting. There's a hot versus a cold method, and the difference between the two is the constant turning, which mixes oxygen into that slow biochemical burning pile that makes up a compost pile. A hot pile is continually mixed so that you're always putting your carbons and nitrogens next to each other. You're making sure that it doesn't get too dry or too wet, and you're constantly adding oxygen into that fire. Believe it or not, a hot pile can get up to a temperature where it will kill weed seeds and kill pathogens. And in fact, if I turn my compost pile, it's not uncommon in cold weather to see it steaming. There needs to be a critical mass or size, ideally for hot piles. About 4 feet around is ideal. And the ratio needs to be fairly close in order to make sure that you're getting that slow biochemical burn. This is very commonly done in commercial systems where they'll use a bulldozer or a skid steer to do that turning. So I'm a cold composter, and primarily the reason is I dislike turning my compost pile. It's very heavy, and it is a chore that I dislike. I will do it on occasion because I want to make sure that I'm having that breakdown over time, and it's mostly finished at the end. There are still a little bit of recognizable scraps in there when I use it. But when I started in the fall and over the winter, it starts to break down, although slower because of the cold. It speeds up in spring, and right now we're at June 1st, and I am adding that compost to my garden continuously, both when I plant and as a mulch, and I'm almost done with my compost pile this year. So the difference between the two is generally a lot more turning. A cold pile will turn into compost over time, but it will still have potential weed seeds or potential pathogens if those were added, and that temperature in a cold pile will not be enough to kill them. So I did a bunch of tests on some compost because I really wanted to see what was in there. And the two different composts that I tested were basically a leaf collection dump site that was provided at the City of Logan's community garden for gardeners to use. And it was a long windrow of compost where the oldest stuff had been there for many, many years and had broken down into a fine leaf compost over a cold process over many years. Tested, the soil pH was 7.7, great organic matter 6.1, and it had tremendous fertility. It was a very fertile product. It was going to feed vegetables for many years. This was a cold process. Another product that I tested was a commercial compost. This was from Athens Hocking Recycling Center, where they take kitchen waste and they incorporate that with wood chips, and then they continuously mix that with equipment. This is a hot process. It gets made really quickly. Same pH, which I thought was interesting. Twice as much organic matter. There was not that leaching out of the organic matter over time that occurred in the cold process. And because it was made quickly and it had less of a leaching effect because it was also done under cover, it had 3 or 4 times the fertility of the cold process. So I thought this was really interesting. But it goes to show that while we don't think of compost as a fertilizer, it has a tremendous amount of nutrition in it and generally incorporates most of the macro and micronutrients in that. So I have a wood stove and we supplement heat at my house by burning hardwood. So I add wood ash to my compost. I don't add the wood ash straight to my vegetable garden. I like to compost it first, and then that product will then be incorporated into my vegetable garden. Wood ash is generally an alkaline product, which is a higher pH. Here in Franklin County, our soils are already alkaline if you're growing in the ground. They might not be if you're in a raised bed or you added different soil products over time. So that is where a soil test comes in handy to check your pH. And then think what wood ash is. Wood ash is similarly to leaves. It is the nutrition breakdown of a tree. The nutrients that are there are the ones that don't gasify off, like a nitrogen or a sulfur. So it is a bunch of nutrition added to your compost pile in mineral form. Keep in mind you're not supposed to add treated wood or painted wood or any of the fabricated wood products that are out there because you might be adding chemicals to your compost pile. So let's talk about a couple of different methods that I like to think of as basically raised beds made out of compost pile that have been around for, in some cases, a long time, in some cases, not so much. But one of those is hugelkultur, which is German for hill culture, and the other is lasagna layering. Both of these basically are piles of organic matter that are added in different layers and then planted into. Think of it as a raised bed made out of a compost pile that uses a cold compost process and breaks down, and you saw what kind of fertility can be in that process if you relate that back to what we saw with the cold compost test from City of Logan's leaf dump site. Because it's cold, it won't kill weeds or disease, and you generally do have to jumpstart it with a little fertilizer to get that started. It might not be at its ideal fertility to grow in right away. Your ingredient list for both of those is vast. Generally, hugelkultur is made out of a carbon core, and a lot of times they'll use logs or sticks and twigs, and that's a carbon sink in the middle where then they layer around it in a hill form. It's got a couple of things about it that I think are really interesting. One of those is you can build a hugelkultur mound on an otherwise poor growing space, and because you're building it up off the ground, that gives you a planting area that might not otherwise be accessible. And I think it has some potentials for built up high to be almost like an accessible raised bed where maybe somebody with limited mobility issues could use that for growing. So basically you can see this, that you have a hill that you build up and it slowly breaks down over time because that's what compost piles do. You need to cover it pretty quickly. They use a sort of a skim coat of dirt on the outside of that, and it needs to be planted into, or one quick rainfall right after you build it is going to wash all that away. I generally recommend you would orient that north-south here up in the north so you take advantage of the movement of the sun. And then like I said, these need to be rebuilt over time as they break down, and in the immediate right after built time period, they might not be as available for heavy production. Here's a hugelkultur mound where they use a carbon core, but they use hay. Straw could also be used, and as you can see, they have that carbon core, they put a skim coat of dirt on it, then and some compost, and then some nitrogens in there. And so it has a lot of similarities to basically a compost pile that you put a dirt layer over and plant into. Lasagna layering is fairly similar. Instead of really being built as a mound, it has a shape that is a little bit more analogous to a regular raised bed. Ideally, this would be created maybe in the fall for spring planting so that it can break down over time and get to that fertility. But again, I like this because this is a way to create new garden space that maybe you could create this on an otherwise unusable area by creating a raised bed out of a compost pile. So it's another one where you will do layers, where maybe on the bottom is you have a carbon, and then you're adding layers of carbons and nitrogens with the top being an organic matter such as compost. If you use manure, you're definitely going to have a time lag before you can plant into that. But as it breaks down over time, you get mixing of these layers, and then you're going to have a usable grow space once that has developed into closer to a finished compost process. So that was a quick overview of composting. Hopefully you have the ability to compost where you're at. I think compost is a dynamite organic matter. I wish I had more of it. I use every drop that I make every year. I try to save a 5-gallon bucket at the year so that when I'm jump starting my compost pile in fall with all those leaves, I can sprinkle a little finished compost inside to give that little bio burst of the bacteria and fungal elements. If you have questions about compost, feel free to give me an email. Shout out, it's mcdermott.15@osu.edu.